Good evening. It's great to be here. I'm honored to be part of a conversation that is long overdue and very important in our community, the idea of placemaking. You see, this is kind of a geeky thing for me to be here because I've been involved and super passionate about placemaking darn near my whole career. So as we enter placemaking in the context of urban revitalization, I thought that I would go in search of the DNA of what makes great places in areas that may be struggling from go. And so I thought that if I was going to take you on a journey to place, that perhaps I should take you to new places. So I'm sharing with you a set of photos from places that I've been around Delaware, in the city of Wilmington, and around the world that have influenced my perception of the importance of place to come up with my topic of place-ification. Guatemala is a beautiful country with a people filled with grit and determination. They're a beautiful people with a long, storied history of struggle and of triumph. But in places of Guatemala, it's broken. It's really, really broken. To some, perhaps so broken that it's inconceivable that you could overcome the issues that are in front of them. But on my trip to Guatemala, I went to a place called Cayala. And Cayala was created by a very famous architect by the name of Leon Carrier. And he had the good fortune to be working with sugarcane developers who struggled because their families were being kidnapped at an alarming rate. They couldn't stop at a stoplight without the fear of being shot or kidnapped. So they created this urban context from scratch. And the result of it was not just ice cream and girlfriends and smiles and joy, but for me, it showed me that perhaps if you could create a new place, you could create hope that went along with it. But then I started to consider the rational argument that perhaps this is just for rich people, the sugarcane families that could afford the things that you saw in the previous picture. So I went looking some more. In Antigua, Guatemala, they have just as difficult a situation. Beautiful people, a faith in their core. And somehow over centuries of earthquakes and civil wars, they've overcome because they have a great place. And in 1944, after they actually had to move the capital out of Antigua, they started to put it back together. And you can see today the juxtaposition of the old and the new. And you begin to understand that if it in our core there is a great place, that you can knock it down several times and it'll just keep coming back. So maybe you just need great places. This is a place that I just happen to be involved with here in Delaware that's built on this exact philosophy of place-ification, the result of making great place. You see, there's no shortage of effort going on. Folks are focused on housing and education and jobs and transportation and natural resources and shelter and food, and the list goes on. And none of those are unimportant. They're all very important. But it makes me think at times why we're not seeing the cohesion that sometimes we need. And I believe that perhaps It's because we're missing the philosophy of place. You see, as other speakers have already mentioned, when you have a great place, it improves the probability of reaching your highest potential. When you have a great place, you have the resiliency that you have in the photo on the left in Trolley Square or on the far right in Atlanta. Shaken to their core at times, but built back because they're great places. And great places, as you also already heard, are built of resiliency. My fear is that if we are devoid of the concept of place, we suffer from fragility. When a school closes, when our architecture lacks the respect of the humanity that lives around it, and when our natural resources are too dangerous to use, that's not place. That promotes fragility. For me, there's a massive contrast that goes on in our community. And it's represented in this picture on, tell me how you get to your place. Does it present a history? Does it present the sign of resilience, optimism, the potentiality of when you approach and cross that chasm? Or does it present for you ambiguity and uncertainty? What does it present to you when you come home? Imagine those small signals that we send. Now, before I get too deep, I just want to talk for a second about why I love place. I love place because I like to have fun. This is Grafton Street in Dublin, Ireland. And on Grafton Street, obviously there's flowers, there's beer, probably a little bit too much beer. There's people, there's shops, there's energy on the street. I love place because I love people. I love place because for me it presents identity, the potential to tell your story. And when you can tell your story, you can project your future. At the top of those stairs is where my family comes from, in a little town in the hills of Italy. They struggled in that house, and to this day, we still go back to that place. Place becomes your identity as a human. It allows you to tell your story to others and project yourself. If you live in historic Newcastle, as I do, suddenly people think you're historians. But if you live on the upper end of the Delaware River, then they think that you know everything there is to know about nature. And if you live in a community that's filled with art, suddenly you're cultured. So tell me, what if you don't? What if when you cross that bridge of ambiguity and ambivalence, this is the architecture you're presented with. These are the signs of your future. This is your present. Is it also your history? Imagine if we replaced it with culture. It's obviously possible in our community. Imagine if we replaced it with nature. Obviously, a potential in our community. Imagine if we replaced it with safe connections for recreation and low-cost transportation to employment. It's obviously possible in our community. So let me ask you, not who do you love, but where do you love? You know, when I give these talks, I often ask the audience, tell me the place where you went on vacation. And when you got back, you said, darn it, if I didn't have my job, I'd live there. You've probably been to some of those places, right? For me, it's this photo that you see of Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. I don't even need to show off the beach. For me, it's that symbol of the bicycle. I don't ever have to get in my car. I could probably drink too much and still get home, right? So for me, my identity becomes wrapped up in my safety, in my mobility, in my enjoyment. So where do you love? I bet you love places and you don't even know why you love them. In his book, The Original Green, my good friend Steve Muzan talks about Da Vinci's Virtuian Man. And thank you for allowing me to put the fig leaf on tonight, because I know this is a PG audience. That figure is representative of the idea that place becomes a reflection of us as men and as women. Our identity is wrapped up in these places. It's wrapped up in the humanism, in architecture. That's why we love that nostalgic look. And we're kind of taken back by modernism. We want to see ourselves reflected in the architecture, not in a lot full of cars. Place reflects our spiritual self, our ability to be independent at the very moment we need to be. We need to access nature because we are natural beings, not just because we like butterflies. We need in a place to be able to nourish ourselves, to be self-sufficient, and to take care of each other. We need to be able to support our neighbors and to socialize, not just because we like the noise of it all. It's because we're human in our core. These are our essential necessities. Place must reflect us as humans. So what's the recipe? Number one, understand the people. If you're going to create a great place, you better listen. You better understand the culture. You better understand the desire for potentiality, and you better celebrate history. Think about locations to sprinkle throughout your community. This is one of my favorite locations, the market in Charleston, South Carolina. In your location should be the list of religion, recreation, your daily needs, education, socialization, everything that I mentioned as part of humanity. But here's where fragile neighborhoods struggle, the anchors. What I mean by an anchor is if you were developing a shopping mall or a strip shopping center, you always have an anchor. Sometimes it's the grocery store, sometimes it's the Apple store. But you always have an anchor. But in challenged communities, the private sector doesn't always step in. So if there is a role for the public sector, I believe it needs to be very, very, very aggressive in landing food, civic institutions like bandstands and schools and parks. Everything the private sector won't do to create those anchors like you would see outside of these areas, the public sector needs to step in and help with. Now, once you have your locations and you understand your people, then you have to start to connect the two. You've got to create, obviously, safe walking, safe biking, safe transportation, and well lit. There's scientific study after scientific study that understands that if you're going to build for humans, you got to think like a human. You got to put everything within a quarter-mile walk. This is a rationale that's been around for centuries. When settlers of every nationality went and they went to different countries and they set up their ports, they looked for fresh water so they could sustain themselves. They immediately put a plaza. On the plaza, they put religion, they put commerce, they put socialization. They became the centers of our town. That became the anchor. You need an edge of your town outside the quarter mile, the center of town, and the quarter-mile walk. Streets need to be beautiful. This is a village called Getsemani in a town called Cartagena, Colombia. This is one of the poorest neighborhoods in town. But they decided Instagram was going to save them. So they invested as an art community in creating wonderful, wonderful, wonderful streets. The streets need to be clean, they need to be safe, they need to be artful, they need to be connected. We need to be joy to our streets. People, locations, anchoring, connections, edges and centers, and streets. They all seem to embody the shot that I took of this young lady. And I was captivated by the joy she had. Because let me tell you something. There's no running water where she is. There's no power. You've got to get in a boat and travel for about an hour to get to education. And so I asked her family, where do you find this kind of joy? Their response is, we love this place. It's place. If you're going to develop in a manner, you must reflect the human image. You must build places with resiliency by investing in culture and recreation and commerce. Oops. And those places become the art of place-ification. And ultimately, they bring us hope. Thank you.